Welcome, Chestnut Hill College, to another edition of Inside the Election with Mike Reid. Today on this show we have Dr. Kovach, professor of sociology here at Chestnut Hill College. We're going to discuss a paper one of his friends written titled A Policy Agenda for the New President of the United States, written by William Young. How's it going, Dr. Kovach?
Pretty good, Mike, pretty good.
So tell us, who is William Young?
Bill Young actually is a friend of mine. I met Bill in the middle 70s when I worked as an economic analyst at the National Association for Home Builders in Washington, D.C. for about 2 years when I was in graduate school. And Bill was an economic analyst at the National Association of Home Builders for his entire working career. He finished his graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania years ago and then got a job at Home Builders and worked there ever since. He's retired now. He's an avid birder and he writes books on birding, et cetera. But he and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about the election, and he calls me every other week or so and kind of talks about his frustration with issues and issues that aren't being discussed, et cetera. And one night we had about an hour and a half conversation. We started talking about, well, what are the issues that the new president, whoever the new president is, really needs to focus on? What should the priorities be? And from that conversation came this paper that Bill wrote, and Bill said, look, he said, I'm not going to publish it, just send it out to friends, and we'll get it out that way. And so that's how it got into your hands.
Well, I notice he addresses more than the common issues, such as who spent more on smear campaigns, as addressed at the last debate at Hofstra University. So can you outline some things for us that he proposes that the candidates should address this upcoming election?
Sure. And as a sociologist, I tend to look at the big picture, and I tend to say, okay, what sort of structural changes is it going to take? Economic changes, policy changes, legal changes, that in the end will result in a better quality of life for almost everybody in this country. And so when I look at issues, I don't look at what I call status issues. Status issues are things like, you talk about who's friends with whom, and who's friends with Bill Ayers, and who spends more money, and partial birth abortion. Those are status issues. They're not ultimately going to affect the quality of life for most Americans.
Also, they could change. I mean, when he gets in office, they could change.
Sure. And so I tend to focus on the big picture issues, and that's where these priorities came from. And I should preface what I say by saying I don't believe either candidate's really going to make significant changes, the kinds that I think we need and the kinds that my friend Bill thinks that we need in this country, because both parties are too dependent on money from various special interests, et cetera. I mean, big corporate America donates almost equally to both Democrats and Republicans. They just want to have access. So I'm pessimistic at that level. But I think there are several things that we need to talk about. Change is tough to do. It's easier to talk about change than to do it. And I think we need a president who will say this country is in crisis. We are in crisis at a couple different levels, and these priorities address that crisis. We need to change the way we live, and when we do, all Americans, I think over the next several decades, we're going to have to adjust our lifestyles because of economic crises, because of environmental crises. And the first change that Bill talks about in his paper is the need to make America carbon neutral. And most of the candidates, are talking about things like a 30% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. But most of the authorities that I've read basically say the crisis is deeper than that. If that's all we're going to do, you might as well forget it. And we're talking about a crisis now that's an irreversible crisis, where species will disappear, where billions of people eventually could be displaced or could die. I mean, in a crisis we can't turn around too easily. And so what Bill suggests, in fact, is that we need to talk about America is 5% of the world's population, but we produce 20% of all the greenhouse gases out there. We're the leader in producing greenhouse gases, so we should be the leader in trying to eliminate them. And Bill says, the next president's priority should be to reduce our carbon emissions by 80 to 90% by 2020. And that seems pretty right. Whoa. And that would require a lot of change. I mean, it would mean we'd have to have tax subsidies and incentives to get people to live differently, to produce products differently, to grow food differently, to shop and heat and cool our homes. All those things would have to change if we're really going to reduce our collective carbon footprint by that much. But that should be the goal that the campaign folks are talking about now. They're not. They're talking about much smaller kinds of goals. But I also believe if we really set that as a goal and said we're going to do whatever it takes to reduce our carbon footprint by 80 to 90% by 2020, it also could become the economic engine that could pull this country out of the slump that we're in. You know, I don't see any other economic engine that could drag us out of the recession that we're in right now.
Well, it's also said renewable resources can't be outsourced.
Yeah, and this could be. I mean, at a bunch of different levels, it would be a change, I think, that would be positive for all of us, you know, for the future, but also economically, I think, for the present. The second change that Bill mentions in his paper, he talks about more progressive taxation. I mean, over the last 3 decades, and you know, you've been in my sociology classes, you've heard me rail, but over the last 3 decades, we've had tax code changes that have resulted in this massive redistribution of wealth upward. So the rich have gotten twice as rich over the last 30 years, basically. Middle class has lost some ground, the poor have gotten a little poorer. That's a problem, and if the cause of the problem has been tax code changes that have resulted, then we need to think about a more progressive tax code right now. We need to think about changes that would tax the wealthy more, real corporate income tax rates. You know, corporate income tax rates always throw around this figure, 35%, and we're the highest, higher than Ireland, blah, blah, but the effective tax rate that corporations really pay is about 7%. They're not paying their fair share either, you know. And we have had, the last 8 years, we've had 8 years of no fiscal responsibility at all. You know, we've been fighting a war, we've been putting it on a credit card. We had the $150 billion stimulus package, and we put that on the national credit card with no thought about how we're going to pay for it. Then comes the $700 billion bailout, we put that on the credit card with not a whole lot of talk about how it's going to be paid for. You know, that's just, it's irresponsible, you know, and we need, if we're going to reduce inequality in this country, then we need to think about a progressive tax policy and tie it into the carbon emissions reduction, you know, where we start to tax carbon emissions in a progressive tax that increases over time so that we can get to that goal of reducing carbon emissions by 80 or 90% by 2020, you know, and along with a really, truly progressive income tax structure where poor folks, where people who make less than $30,000 a year don't pay anything. You know, and then you have a graduated income tax.
So you're saying there's more than just saying I'll lower taxes to this issue then?
Yeah, I mean, this really requires some thinking about, well, what is the structural problem? The structural problem, as I see it, that relates to so many of the social ills that we see, has been this inequality that's gotten so much worse over the last 3 decades. Well, if that's the problem, then what do you need to do, in fact, to reduce inequality? And of course, you know, you hear the campaign, oh, he wants to redistribute the wealth. The wealth has been redistributed. It's redistributed upward over the last 3 decades. And it's not just a question of redistributing the wealth. It's more about kind of a fair shares policy in this society that not only reduces